Keros-7 revealed itself long before Marcus Hale stepped onto its surface. The moment the landing ramp lowered, a dry, metallic wind swept through the air, carrying with it a faint vibration that resonated in the chest like an echo of some distant, unseen engine. The alien cadets hesitated at the threshold, each of them gripping the straps of their supply packs with trembling fingers. The instructors had warned them in advance that Keros-7 was not a normal training ground. It was classified as a Class-7 Deathworld not because of a single catastrophic threat, but because of its cycles, seasons so violent and so predictable that native life survived only by moving constantly. Marcus watched the horizon with an expression that seemed far too calm for a place famous for killing entire expeditions. He studied the sky, the oddly fractured clouds, and the way the long grass bent in the shifting currents. The air had layers, as if several climates pushed against one another, never fully blending. For Marcus, this first breath of Keros-7 already told him more than the instructor's briefing had. The Academy shuttle rose behind him, leaving a dull roar that faded into nothing. The alien cadets stood in a loose formation, their eyes scanning the environment with growing dread. Some tried to hide their fear, but the tension made their breathing sharp and uneven. The instructors, tall reptilian veterans with mottled armor plating, presented the rules in a tone stripped of reassurance. The mission was simple on paper: survive one full cycle of the planet's shifting seasons. But survival on Keros-7 required more than strength or weapons. The instructors explained that every 100 days, in a pattern that repeated endlessly, the planet shifted. Landscapes cracked open, storms boiled from the ground instead of falling from the sky, and predatory species multiplied overnight. Entire biomes dissolved, reformed, or migrated in unison. Anything that stayed still died. The instructors gestured toward a series of old extraction platforms half swallowed by the terrain. Each platform had been abandoned decades ago, overtaken by the planet's relentless transformations. The message was clear. The ground beneath the group was temporary, and the world around them was already preparing to change. Marcus listened without fear. He focused not on the dire warnings, but on the subtle cues in the environment. He noticed how certain plants had thick roots clustered on one side of their stalks, as if preparing to anchor themselves against winds that shifted direction seasonally. He noticed that some bird-like creatures circled in wide spirals that expanded toward the northeast, not randomly, but with purpose. The alien cadets were too overwhelmed to see the significance, but Marcus felt instinctively that the planet was not chaotic at all. It was rhythmic. It followed a discipline harsher than anything the Academy had taught. When the instructors concluded the briefing, the group was told to set up a temporary camp near a ridge of fractured basalt. The cadets began unpacking equipment with shaking hands. Marcus moved more slowly, kneeling to press his palm against the ground. The soil was warm, unnaturally so. Heat rose through it in pulses, and he realized the region was entering a phase where subsurface magma channels approached the crust. That meant the terrain would not remain stable for long. He glanced at the ridge rising above them, noticing that several sections bore deep gouges. Something had scraped against them, either during a migration or during a geological shift. The instructors had chosen this landing site carefully, but even they seemed uneasy. Marcus walked toward the ridge, ignoring the muttered complaints of the cadets who accused him of wandering off. He examined the gouges closely. Some were fresh. He crouched, brushing his fingers across the mineral dust that had not yet been scattered by the wind. A creature had passed through this area recently, one large enough to carve deep paths through stone. Yet the tracks did not cut across the terrain randomly. They curved gradually eastward, as if following a direction dictated by instinct. Marcus whispered a quiet thought to himself, noting the angle, the depth, and the spacing of each mark. Something in him recognized the pattern, like reading the early lines of a story the others had not realized was written. Meanwhile, the cadets struggled to erect their shelters. The wind intensified, swaying the structures before they were even finished. One alien cadet, a slender figure with milky blue skin, let out a frustrated cry when a support beam snapped. Marcus turned his head slightly but did not intervene. He knew the shelters would not matter. Not here. Not on a world that rejected anything stationary. Still, he approached after a moment, offering a brief comment that sounded more like an observation than advice. He explained that the winds were not random. They strengthened along a predictable axis, which meant any shelter built perpendicular to that axis would fail. The alien cadets stared at him in disbelief, unsure whether to resent his calmness or cling to it. Before anyone could respond, a deep tremor rolled through the ground. Pebbles danced. The cadets tensed, expecting a predator attack, but Marcus watched the horizon, unblinking. The tremor was shallow. It was not caused by a creature, but by a subsurface shift. The instructors confirmed this seconds later, though their own surprise was evident. This shift was not scheduled, not according to the Academy's outdated geological charts. Marcus, however, felt no surprise. He understood enough already to suspect that the charts were based on incomplete patterns. The planet operated on cycles longer and more intricate than the instructors had assumed. The tremor passed, leaving the cadets too shaken to continue working. Marcus stood beside the ridge, watching as spires of dust rose in the distance where the ground had fractured. He knew exactly what would happen next. The spires meant underground pressure was seeking release, and when that pressure broke through, the landscape would change rapidly. Cracks would form. Some areas would collapse, others would rise. The ridge they stood on would likely become unstable within days. To the instructor's alarm, Marcus asked how soon the group was expected to move. When they replied that the first relocation was scheduled for 2 weeks later, Marcus frowned. He quietly insisted the schedule was wrong. The instructors dismissed him at first, but Marcus did not argue. He simply stated calmly that the environment was already transitioning into the first extinction phase. He pointed at the migratory gouges, the direction of the wind, and the heat pulses in the soil. Nothing in his tone was frantic. He spoke as though he were pointing out a simple miscalculation. The instructors exchanged troubled glances. The cadets looked back and forth between them, unsure whom to trust. The tension grew until a sudden burst of steam erupted from a fissure beyond the ridge, sending a plume of scalding vapor into the air. The instructors finally conceded that Marcus might be seeing something they had missed. As night approached, the atmosphere thickened to a hazy copper tone. The cadets huddled restlessly around the makeshift camp, whispering about the strange human who seemed unafraid of the Deathworld beneath their feet. Marcus sat on a rise overlooking the terrain, watching how the last rays of light filtered through the dust. He traced invisible lines across the landscape with his eyes, marking the movements of creatures he could not yet see, but whose patterns he already sensed. Class-7 was not trying to kill him. It was teaching him. It was revealing the rules of its cycles, one subtle sign at a time. By the time the stars appeared, Marcus knew with absolute certainty that the group was standing at the edge of a massive shift. The first cycle was coming faster than anyone anticipated, and while the cadets trembled at every distant rumble, Marcus stared into the darkness with quiet focus, ready to face whatever the planet revealed next. Marcus Hale rose before dawn, long before the cadets even stirred. The camp was still quiet except for the gentle clatter of loose stones rolling down the unstable ridge. The copper haze from the previous sunset had not vanished overnight. Instead, it lingered like a thin veil stretched across the sky, distorting the stars into faint, trembling patterns. Marcus crouched beside a patch of brittle vegetation that clung to the rocky soil. He pressed his fingertips into the dirt, feeling the warmth that pulsed rhythmically beneath the surface. It reminded him of a heartbeat, steady, deliberate, impossibly precise. The planet was signaling another shift, one that he had expected from the moment he first stepped onto Class-7. The rest of the group still believed the first extinction phase would occur days later, but Marcus trusted his instincts more than the instructor's outdated predictions. He took out a simple mapping tablet, though he quickly abandoned it when he realized the electromagnetic interference distorted the display. The tablet was nearly useless on a world where magnetic fields twisted like serpents beneath the crust. Instead, he relied on observation. He used a piece of charcoal from last night's dying fire to draw lines on a flat stone. He marked the direction of the prevailing wind, the movement of the circling birds overhead, and the cracks that had appeared in the valley floor. Each element contributed to a silent story the planet was telling, one that only he seemed willing to read. He tapped the stone lightly, making sure the lines aligned with the growing patch of heated soil. His eyes narrowed with understanding when he noticed that the warmest sections formed a crescent pattern pointing southward. That meant the subsurface channels were shifting, dragging heat toward another region of the planet. And where heat rose, predators followed. Behind him, one of the alien cadets stumbled out of a half-collapsed shelter, rubbing his eyes and muttering complaints about the cold. The cadet froze when he noticed Marcus already working. For a moment, he watched Marcus with a mixture of confusion and envy. Marcus did not acknowledge him. The silence stretched until the cadet turned away, unnerved by the human's focus. Marcus was not trying to impress anyone. He was trying to survive, and the only reason he remained calm was because information, not strength, decided survival here. When the sun finally rose, it did so reluctantly, casting uneven beams that flickered as if filtered through moving layers of dust. The alien cadets gathered near the instructors for a morning briefing, and Marcus joined them without putting away his stone map. The instructors looked exhausted. The unexpected tremor from the night before had forced them to reconsider their schedule, and the stress showed in their narrowed eyes and stiff shoulders. One instructor attempted to reassure the cadets, insisting that the group would adjust the plan as needed. Marcus listened quietly, but he could not ignore the mistake hidden in the instructor's tone. The instructor spoke as if the planet's shifts were simply unpredictable hazards. Marcus knew better. He had already begun to see the pattern beneath the chaos, and every detail only reinforced his growing conviction that the planet was following a precise seasonal rhythm. After the briefing, Marcus walked away from the group and climbed to a higher vantage point. The ridge offered a wider view of the landscape, sweeping plains interrupted by jagged fissures, clusters of crystalline growths shimmering faintly under the rising sun, and a distant herd of massive horn-shell beasts moving in a slow, deliberate formation. Marcus studied the herd carefully. Each creature walked in the same direction, following an invisible route carved by generations of survival. The herd did not simply migrate for food. It migrated to avoid the extinction phases that reshaped entire regions. Marcus watched their movements for several minutes. The creatures avoided the freshly formed fissures instinctively, curving around them long before the terrain fully split. That meant the herd sensed subtle signals the cadets could not. Marcus wondered if he could learn to sense those signals as well. He spent the rest of the morning observing smaller creatures too, swift, insect-like runners that darted between cracks, burrowing rodents that popped out of holes only to vanish again within seconds, and winged gliders that soared silently through the shifting air currents. Marcus tracked their movements by drawing thin lines in the dirt. The lines formed arcs, spirals, and sweeping trails that converged toward the same general path the hornshell herd followed. Each species moved differently, yet all their paths aligned. Marcus felt a surge of clarity. He realized Class-7 was not a death world because it was hostile. It was a death world because survival demanded precision. Every living thing followed a migration pattern that mirrored the planet's internal cycles. Any deviation meant extinction. As he continued observing, the wind changed direction abruptly. A cold gust swept across the ridge, carrying with it the scent of minerals and something sharper, like the faint trace of ozone left behind by a lightning strike. Marcus turned his head toward the south. Dark clouds were forming unnaturally low on the horizon, rolling forward as if pulled by unseen hands. The alien cadets noticed the clouds too, and quickly became anxious. One of the instructors tried to calm them, insisting the storm would pass harmlessly. Marcus, however, shook his head. He had already identified the storm's pattern. Class-7 did not create random weather. Each storm traveled along a predictable path, and this storm's path intersected with the campsite. Marcus approached the instructors and pointed toward the storm. The instructors tried to dismiss his concerns at first, but he stood firm. He explained that the storm's formation matched the heat pulses in the soil and the wind's acceleration. The instructors exchanged uncertain glances. They knew Marcus had been right about the tremor. Still, they hesitated to rely on a cadet's observations over their own training. Marcus did not step back. He insisted the storm would carry corrosive particles that could erode shelters within minutes. He pointed at the dirt beneath them. Even now, the dust was beginning to tremble in anticipation of the coming wave. When the instructors finally agreed to verify his prediction, the storm had already gained speed. Marcus urged the group to relocate immediately to the stony overhang north of the ridge, but the cadets were slow to react. Panic spread through the group as the wind strengthened and the sky darkened. Marcus did not wait for permission. He grabbed his pack and started moving, shouting for the cadets to follow. His tone was calm, but his urgency was unmistakable. The instructors, realizing the danger, ordered the group to move as well. Within minutes, the first particles from the storm reached the edge of the ridge, sizzling as they hit the remains of the collapsed shelters. From the safety of the overhang, Marcus watched as the storm consumed the campsite. The shelters disintegrated in seconds. The cadets stared in horrified silence, realizing that Marcus had understood the planet's rhythm better than any of them. Even the instructors looked shaken. Marcus did not turn toward them for recognition. Instead, he knelt and began updating his stone map with new observations. The storm's path, the herd's migration, and the heat pulses in the soil were all parts of the same seasonal system. He was beginning to see the full shape of it. As evening settled in, Marcus sat alone near the edge of the overhang, watching the storm fade into the distance. He felt no relief, only determination. The planet had given him another piece of the puzzle, and if he could uncover the remaining pieces in time, he could ensure that the group did not merely survive the next shift. They could navigate it. He understood now that Class-7 was not unbeatable. It was readable, and he intended to read every line before the next extinction season arrived. Marcus Hale barely slept during the night that followed the corrosive storm. The overhang protected the group, but the constant grinding of wind against the stone kept him awake. He lay still with his eyes open, listening not to the storm itself, but to the rhythm beneath it. The planet breathed in pulses, long and slow, as if exhaling heat across entire continents and inhaling cold through the fissures that split the ground. By the time the first pale light appeared beyond the ridge, Marcus had already formed the framework of a theory powerful enough to terrify him. The planet did not shift randomly. It shifted in an exact order, like a machine beneath the crust executing a cycle. And if he could decipher the sequence, he could predict not just storms or earthquakes, but every stage of the extinction pattern that was about to unfold. When morning arrived, the cadets looked exhausted. Some were shivering under blankets, while others huddled in silence, staring at the ruined campsite in the distance. The instructors tried to keep the group composed, but even they struggled with the unsettling idea that the planet was accelerating its transformation. Marcus rose before the others, gathered a handful of smooth stones from the overhang, and arranged them in a long line. He knelt beside the row and began scratching symbols onto each stone using a broken shard of crystal. The sound of scraping attracted attention almost immediately. One cadet whispered to another that Marcus was attempting some primitive ritual. Marcus ignored the remark. He was not trying to perform anything mystical. He was recording data. He placed the stones in a curved pattern, aligning the arc with the rising sun. Each stone represented a phase of the cycle he had pieced together through observation: the heat surge, the corrosive winds, the predator migration, the ground fracture, and then the regrowth phase that followed after the devastation. As he arranged the stones, He adjusted their spacing minutely. The cycle was not perfectly even. Some phases lasted longer, depending on the region, but the order was always the same. When he finished the pattern, he sat back and studied it as if it were a map of a road no one else could see. The stones formed a path that curved southeast, toward the plains where the hornshell herd had been moving the day before. His expectations were confirmed. The herd was already following the future shape of the extinction season. One of the instructors approached him cautiously. The instructor's tone carried a mix of skepticism and curiosity as he asked Marcus what the stones meant. Marcus explained that the cycle had an internal logic similar to a rotating storm belt on certain ocean planets. He traced the arc with his finger, describing how the heat pulse expanded outward first, then collapsed inward, driving storms and predators ahead of it. Marcus tapped one of the stones at the far end of the arc and stated that the bloom would arrive by the next dusk. Several cadets gasped. The instructors stared at him in disbelief. Marcus elaborated, pointing at the cloud formations above the plains. The clouds were thinning too quickly for a normal weather shift. That meant oxygen levels were fluctuating, an early sign of massive underground activity. The predators would follow the oxygen trails upward, emerging just beyond the ridge. If the group remained under the overhang when it happened, the creatures would corner them. The instructors hesitated before issuing a new order: gather supplies and prepare to move before the sun reached its highest point. The cadets scrambled to comply. Marcus did not join the panic. Instead, he continued refining his stone map. He drew lines in the dirt between the stones, connecting each phase with the path he believed the group needed to follow next. His next destination was a series of cliff formations he had noted during his earlier climb. Those cliffs provided a natural barrier strong enough to block the predators once the bloom began, but reaching them required moving across unstable ground, and if the group moved even an hour too late, the predators would outrun them. To ensure accuracy, Marcus climbed to the top of the overhang to gain a clearer view of the landscape. From that height, he saw faint tremors ripple across the plains like waves moving beneath a thick blanket. The hornshell herd was accelerating, their rhythmic strides beating heavily against the ground. The gliders that roamed the skies shifted their flight paths toward higher altitudes. Even the insects changed direction, creating tiny rivers of movement that converged toward the southeast. Marcus watched it all with sharp concentration. Every movement confirmed the pattern he had deciphered. The planet was preparing for the bloom, and the bloom was preparing for migration. He descended from the overhang and approached the instructors with the urgency he usually kept hidden. He pointed toward the plains and explained that the tremors meant the predators had already begun stirring. The instructors exchanged alarmed glances. They ordered the group to begin immediate evacuation. The cadets struggled to secure their equipment, dropping packs and tripping over cracked stones in their haste. Marcus helped those closest to him, though he did so without emotion. He understood that delays could cost the group their chance of survival. The march toward the cliffs was grueling. The instructors roared commands as the emerging creatures clawed through the soil in a frenzy. Their bodies were dark and sleek, adapted to the underground heat, and their jaws snapped at anything that moved. The group reached the cliffs moments before the predators surged fully into the open. Marcus guided the instructors to a narrow passage between two rock faces. The predators were too large to fit through the gap, and their momentum carried them past the entrance, searching for easier prey. The cadets clung to the rock walls, trembling uncontrollably, but Marcus stood motionless, listening to the distant rumble of the creatures as they stampeded across the plains. The instructors stared at him with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief, struggling to comprehend how a cadet had known the exact timing of the bloom. Marcus knelt once more and drew another arc in the dirt. The cycle was unfolding exactly as he had predicted, and now that the predator bloom had passed, he could calculate the next phase. The planet was still deadly, but with each prediction, he drew closer to mastering the rhythm that defined Class-7. The instructors watched him silently, realizing that Marcus was no longer just another cadet. He was becoming the only guide who could lead them through the cycle still ahead. The narrow passage between the cliffs sheltered the cadets through the worst of the predator bloom, but Marcus Hale knew the safety would not last. Once the creatures dispersed across the plains in search of new hunting grounds, the planet would transition into its next phase. He stood at the cliff entrance, gazing at the dim horizon, where violet clouds dissolved into streaks of orange. The air shifted subtly, taking on a faint metallic scent. For Mark, the only safe route required following the eastern ridgeline until the group reached a basin he had glimpsed earlier. The basin was surrounded by sheer cliff walls and layered rock shelves that could protect them from the vegetation wave. The instructors asked him how far the basin lay. He estimated half a day of travel, assuming the ground remained stable long enough for them to cross. As soon as the sun crested the cliffs, Marcus led the group out of the passage. The cadets followed with clear reluctance. Many still trembled from the predator surge, and every distant thud made their steps falter. Marcus kept a steady pace, moving across terrain that cracked and trembled beneath his boots. The regrowth phase had already begun deeper in the plains. Faint green structures rose from the soil like delicate crystalline needles, growing faster than natural plants had any right to. Marcus walked beside them without touching them. He knew the needles would release toxic spores once they reached maturity. The cadets behind him gasped as the needles elongated with each passing minute. No one dared brush against them. As the group continued east, the ground sloped downward, revealing a stretch of open land framed by sharp ridges. Marcus stopped for a moment and surveyed the landscape. Columns of dust rose in the distance, forming spirals that twisted until they resembled shimmering towers. The cadets whispered nervously, unsure whether the formations were natural or alive. Marcus recognized them immediately. They were the early stages of the terrain shift. The soil beneath the region was preparing to break and reform, creating a labyrinth of new fissures. He urged the instructors to quicken the pace. If the group did not reach the basin before the terrain collapsed, the shifting ground would swallow them. The march became more difficult as the planet's pulse intensified. Warm surges traveled through the earth, forcing the cadets to keep their balance while moving across unstable ground. Marcus walked ahead, navigating around dangerous patches where the soil thinned. At one point, the ground beneath him trembled violently, cracking open just a few meters away. A surge of hot vapor shot upward, followed by the emergence of thick vine-like roots. The roots twisted rapidly, curling around each other as if competing for space. Marcus jumped back and signaled for the group to divert around the fissure. The cadets obeyed instantly, terrified of the living growth expanding across the plains. As the day progressed, the atmosphere grew hazy. Marcus knew the haze was another sign of the approaching vegetation wave. The planet produced the haze during the regrowth phase to stimulate rapid expansion of plant life. Soon, entire forests could grow in hours, but only in areas where the ground remained intact long enough to support them. The basin he sought would remain untouched because the cliffs surrounding it blocked the wave's momentum. Marcus walked swiftly, pushing the group toward the ridgeline. The sun climbed higher, illuminating the crystalline plants that spread like glittering shards across the ground. During the march, one cadet stumbled near a patch of unstable rock. Marcus immediately grabbed his arm and pulled him back before the rock collapsed. A moment later, the patch disintegrated into a swirling sinkhole filled with glowing moss. The cadet looked at Marcus with wide, terrified eyes. Marcus nodded once, silently indicating that the cadet needed to remain alert. He could not afford to stop or comfort anyone. Survival required movement, and the planet punished hesitation. The instructors reinforced his urgency, shouting for the group to keep tight formation and follow Marcus's path exactly. As the group reached the eastern ridgeline, the sky darkened. Thick, rolling clouds gathered overhead, swirling in chaotic patterns. Marcus recognized this shift as the precursor to acid rains. He knew the rains would begin within the hour, and once they started, the vegetation wave would surge across the plains at lethal speed. He urged the instructors to keep the group moving along the ridge. Every second mattered now. The cadets' breathing grew heavier as they climbed over sharp rocks and navigated narrow ledges. The wind carried the faint scent of burnt minerals, another unmistakable warning from the planet. Finally, Marcus spotted the basin in the distance. It lay nestled between towering cliffs, its rocky floor wide enough to accommodate the entire group. He pointed urgently and ordered the cadets to descend. They scrambled down the rocky slope, gripping protruding stones and sliding across loose gravel. Marcus reached the basin floor first and examined the cliffs. The walls were thick enough to block the regrowth wave, and the rock surfaces showed signs of previous cycles. The basin had survived countless shifts, and Marcus felt a rare sense of relief knowing the group had reached it in time. Before the group could rest, a loud crack echoed across the plains. Marcus looked upward and saw the first drops of rain falling from the dark clouds, thick droplets that hissed when they struck the ground. The instructors shouted warnings, and the cadets rushed under the cliffs for shelter. Marcus remained in the open for a moment, watching as the rain intensified. Each drop left a small burn mark on the stone before evaporating. He stepped backward under the cliff only when the wave began to sweep across the plains. The vegetation erupted outward like a living storm. Massive roots burst from the soil, intertwining in swirling patterns. Tree-like structures grew in seconds, rising several meters into the air before collapsing under their own weight. The plains transformed into a chaotic sea of growth, but the basin remained untouched. The cliffs redirected the wave around the sheltered area, exactly as Marcus predicted. The cadets watched in stunned silence as the world outside twisted, regrew, and shattered in rapid succession. Marcus stood at the cliff entrance, his gaze sweeping across the transformed landscape. He felt the cycle continuing, each phase building toward the next. The planet was not slowing down, it was accelerating. And now that the regrowth wave had passed, Marcus could already sense the beginning of the next season forming at the edges of the horizon. He knew the group could not remain in the basin for long. Class-7 was still rewriting itself, and another dangerous shift loomed in the distance. He turned toward the instructors and informed them that the march was far from over. The cycle was only halfway complete, and the final phases would be even deadlier. The instructors exchanged uneasy glances, but they did not question him. The cadets stared at him with a mixture of fear and trust, realizing that only Marcus understood the path ahead. And Marcus, with the planet's rhythm beating in his mind, began planning the next move. The basin protected the group through the violent regrowth wave, but Marcus Hale knew the planet was not finished reshaping itself. Class-7 did not allow long periods of safety. Every calm moment existed only to prepare living things for the next shift. As the last surge of accelerated vegetation collapsed outside the cliffs, Marcus stood at the edge of the basin, quietly scanning the sky. The dark clouds had begun to thin, revealing streaks of sharp gold light that cut through the haze like blades. This light was different from the dim glow the planet often produced during earlier phases. The gold carried heat without warmth, a strange radiance that suggested a transition. Marcus recognized the signal at once. The cycle was approaching its final stage, the collapse and reset. He wiped the dust from the stone wall behind him and began drawing a new arc with his fingertip. The lines stretched wider than before, curving sharply to represent the violent contraction of the planet's shifting systems. As the cadets recovered under the cliffs, he studied each line carefully. He knew the next phase would not involve predators, storms, or vegetation. It would involve the planet itself. The crust would tighten like a closing fist, causing massive sinkholes, collapsing ridges, and waves of seismic pressure that could crush anyone caught outside stable ground. The basin had protected the group so far, but the final phase demanded movement again. This time, however, the direction changed. The danger would come from below, not above or ahead. Survival required reaching higher ground, an elevated plateau Marcus had seen earlier when he climbed the cliffs. He approached the instructors to explain the situation. His voice remained level, but urgency hid beneath every word. The instructors asked how long the group had before the collapse began. Marcus hesitated for the first time since arriving on Keros-7. The signals were stronger than usual. The cycle was accelerating at a pace beyond what he had predicted. He told the instructors they had only a few hours. The instructors exchanged a tense glance, then announced to the cadets that the group needed to leave immediately. The cadets groaned in exhaustion, but there was no room for argument. Marcus urged them to gather their packs and prepare for the steep climb ahead. The ascent out of the basin was brutal. Loose stones slid under the cadets' boots, and sharp shards of rock scraped their hands as they climbed. Marcus moved ahead to find the safest path. He avoided narrow ledges and unstable rock fragments, guiding the group along sections reinforced by thick mineral plates. His movements were precise, almost instinctive, as if the terrain whispered its secrets directly into his mind. By midday, the sun cast long, jagged shadows across the plains, lighting the cracks that formed near the horizon. The ground trembled faintly, signaling the beginning of the collapse. A deep groan resonated from beneath the earth, followed by the sudden sinking of a distant ridge. The cadets froze in fear, but Marcus shouted for them to continue climbing. His clear voice cut through the panic, pushing the group upward. As the group ascended, the basin behind them shifted violently. Huge sections of rock plunged into widening fissures, disappearing into darkness. The sight sent waves of terror through the cadets, but Marcus did not look back. He kept his eyes fixed on the plateau. The instructors reinforced his commands, urging everyone to move faster. The climb became steeper as the planet's tremors intensified. Marcus paused occasionally to scan the terrain, adjusting the route to avoid new cracks that formed unpredictably. At one point, a cadet nearly slipped when a ledge broke beneath his feet. Marcus reached down and pulled him up with a sharp, decisive motion. The cadet whispered a hoarse thank you, gripping Marcus's arm with trembling hands. Marcus nodded once, then helped him regain balance before continuing the ascent. By late afternoon, the group reached the edge of the plateau. The climb had drained every cadet, and many collapsed to their knees upon reaching the top. Marcus remained standing, scanning the landscape for signs of the next shift. From this elevation, he saw the plains transform below. The regrown vegetation collapsed again, sucked into the widening fissures. Entire sections of terrain dropped, then folded upon themselves as if swallowed by an invisible force. The collapse spread rapidly, consuming everything in its path. The cadets watched in horrified silence as the world below rearranged itself into new shapes. Marcus walked toward the far end of the plateau, keeping a respectful distance from the unstable edge. He knelt and pressed his palm against the rock. The surface felt cold and still, finally stable. The plateau was not part of the collapsing crust. It belonged to the core layer, the deepest and oldest structure of Keros-7. Marcus realized this elevation had survived countless cycles, serving as a temporary refuge for any creature able to reach it in time. He stood and motioned for the instructors. He told them the plateau would remain safe until the cycle finished rebuilding the lower regions. The instructors exhaled with relief, realizing the worst phase was nearly over. As evening approached, the sky shifted again. The gold streaks faded, replaced by a deep, quiet blue. The tremors slowed and eventually stopped. The collapse ended with a final shudder that rolled across the plains like a sigh. The ground settled, and the landscape below transformed into a fresh, unrecognizable terrain. Marcus watched the last tremor fade with a calm expression. The cycle was complete. The instructors approached him, their faces lined with exhaustion and disbelief. One of them asked how Marcus had managed to predict every phase so accurately. Marcus hesitated, searching for the right words. He explained that the planet had never been chaotic. It had spoken through signs: the wind, the soil, the animals, the heat. The world followed a rhythm, and once he understood that rhythm, everything aligned. The instructors nodded slowly, absorbing the truth that had eluded them for years. The cadets listened as well, their eyes shining with newfound respect. Marcus had not merely survived the planet, he had understood it. When the Academy shuttle finally arrived days later, the instructors submitted a full report. They documented every phase of the cycle and emphasized Marcus's role in guiding the group through it. Marcus walked aboard the shuttle quietly, unaware of the weight of what he had accomplished. The cadets watched him with admiration, whispering about the strange human who had saved all of them by reading a Deathworld like a book. Back at the Academy, officials reviewed the instructor's report and were stunned. No cadet team had ever survived a full cycle on Class-7 without casualties. Marcus not only guided his group through the cycle, but also mapped the planet's migration patterns with a completeness no researcher had achieved. The Academy declared his findings a breakthrough in xenogeological survival studies. His migration map became mandatory curriculum. Future cadets would study his predictions, his diagrams, and his method of reading the planet through instinct and observation. Marcus did not seek recognition. He simply accepted that he had learned something profound. Class-7 was dangerous, but not senseless. It was a world built on precise rhythms, and once he understood those rhythms, he realized something unexpected. The planet was not hostile toward life. It simply demanded respect for its rules. As he stepped out of the Academy Hall after the final briefing, he looked up at the stars. The cycle on Class-7 had left an imprint on him, not of fear, but of understanding. The universe was vast and unpredictable, but even the deadliest worlds carried logic beneath their violence. And as long as he was willing to listen, he knew he could face whatever came next. The story ended not with triumph, but with clarity. Marcus had survived the cycle, saved the group, and revealed the truth behind a world long misunderstood. And in doing so, he proved something far greater. Knowledge, not strength, shaped survival on even the most impossible of worlds.